leaving only shadows and whispers behind. The crumbling remains of Harrow's Point Amusement Park was no exception. It stood like a decaying relic, forgotten by time, yet somehow still pulsing with a sinister energy. The park's history was a cocktail of tragedy and rumor, a patchwork of unexplained accidents and strange disappearances. Locals avoided speaking of it, preferring to forget its existence. Teenagers, of course, dared one another to sneak in, but none stayed long. They said the clowns were still there, laughing. I was a freelance journalist, always chasing stories of the eerie and the unknown. Harrow's Point had been haunting my thoughts for months, the tale of the laughing clowns growing more vivid with each passing day. It was said that once, many years ago, an entire troupe of clowns had vanished during a performance, and their laughter could still be heard echoing through the park at night. On the last evening of October, I found myself pulling into the weed-choked parking lot, the air sharp with the first bite of winter. The sun was setting, casting a purplish hue over the dying landscape. A sense of foreboding gnawed at my stomach, but curiosity had always been my downfall. The entrance gates loomed ahead, twisted metal shaped into grotesque, grinning clown faces. Their hollow eyes seemed to follow me as I approached, a shiver crawling down my spine. With a creak that felt far too deliberate, I pushed the gates open, and a sharp gust of wind sent a shower of brittle leaves swirling around my feet. The park was a skeleton of its former self. Rides stood like rusted bones, their bright colors faded and flaking, their joy long extinguished. The silence was thick, oppressive, as though the air itself held its breath, waiting. Every step I took felt like I was disturbing something ancient, something that should have been left undisturbed. Ahead of me, the funhouse rose from the darkness. Its paint was peeling, but the garish, oversized grin of the entrance still leered, welcoming me with mock enthusiasm. The gaping mouth, once a source of joy, now felt like the entry to something far darker, something waiting. As I neared the funhouse, a high-pitched giggle broke the silence. It was faint, but unmistakable, a child's laugh carried on the wind. I froze, my heart pounding in my chest. The sound felt wrong, twisted, as though it didn't belong to anything human. My rational mind told me it was just the wind, a trick of the decaying structures. But my gut knew better. I hesitated at the threshold of the funhouse, my hand trembling as I reached for the door. Before I could touch it, the door slammed shut with a force that echoed through the park. The air around me thickened, heavy with the scent of mildew and something far more unsettling, an underlying sweetness, like decayed candy mixed with rot. I pulled out my flashlight and flicked it on. Its weak beam cut through the shadows, illuminating the tattered remnants of the funhouse's former glory. And then, that sound again, the unmistakable giggle of children, but it was closer this time, all around me. Fear gnawed at me, screaming at me to turn back, to leave the park and never return. But something pulled me forward. Maybe it was the lure of the story, or maybe something darker had already begun to take hold. With each step I took deeper into the funhouse, the laughter grew louder, more maniacal. It echoed off the warped mirrors and twisted corridors, an endless symphony of madness. I turned a corner, and there, for a fleeting second, I saw them. Figures, tall and lanky, their painted smiles grotesque, their laughter like nails scraping against my mind. And then they were gone, swallowed by the darkness once more. I should have left. I should have turned back and fled. But I didn't. And that was my first mistake. The echoes of laughter followed me, creeping into my bones, twisting something inside me. And as I ventured further into the heart of Harrow's Point, I knew this was only the beginning. The days after that night blurred together in a haze of unease. Sleep became a distant memory. Each time I closed my eyes, I could still hear the echo of those unsettling giggles. And when sleep finally claimed me, it was filled with visions of twisted, painted faces grinning in the dark. My apartment felt colder, emptier, as if some fragment of that cursed amusement park had followed me home. I had become obsessed with the place. The funhouse gnawed at my mind like a parasite, growing stronger with each passing day. I began researching the history of Harrow's Point more deeply, uncovering forgotten stories, buried articles, and faded photographs. Most of it was just local gossip. Haunted places always have legends. But there was something about the clowns. Their story felt different, more real. Years ago, in its heyday, the amusement park had featured a traveling troupe of clowns who were infamous for their unsettling routines. Their makeup was grotesque, their laughter disturbing even to the most seasoned carnival goers. They were beloved by some, feared by others, but everyone knew them. Then one night, during a performance, the entire troupe vanished. No one saw them leave. No bodies were found. The park closed soon after, following a string of bizarre accidents that people quietly attributed to the curse of the clowns. The deeper I dug, the more I felt their presence. They weren't gone. They had never left. Harrow's Point was their domain, and they waited for anyone foolish enough to wander into their funhouse. But that wasn't the worst of it. There were other disappearances. Kids, teenagers. Their faces showed up in faded missing person reports, all of them last seen near Harrow's Point. The townsfolk didn't talk about it, almost as if they had collectively agreed to pretend those children never existed. But they did exist, and I was beginning to understand why they were never found. 2 weeks after my first visit, I found myself back in front of the rusted gates. I didn't remember driving there, yet here I was, the same cold wind biting at my skin, the same twisted clown faces grinning down at me. The funhouse loomed ahead, its dark entrance like a mouth eager to swallow me whole. I should have turned back. I should have left. But something inside me, a force stronger than fear, pulled me forward. The gates groaned as I pushed them open, the rusted hinges screaming in protest. The park seemed darker this time, more alive. The wind howled through the skeletal remains of the rides, but beneath it, there was something else. A murmur, a soft, ever-present whisper that seemed to come from the ground beneath my feet. The funhouse doors were already open, waiting for me. My heart pounded as I crossed the threshold. The scent of grease paint and stale popcorn thick in the air. This time I wasn't surprised when the door slammed shut behind me with a deafening crash. I fumbled with my flashlight, but the beam flickered, dimming to almost nothing. The funhouse was suffocating. The walls seemed to close in around me, bending and warping like a nightmare. My footsteps echoed louder than they should have, like I wasn't alone. And then, the laughter returned. But this time it was different. Louder. Closer. It wasn't just one voice. It was a chorus of giggles, twisted and unnatural, reverberating off the walls. It surrounded me, filled my head until I could barely think. My breath came in ragged gasps as I stumbled forward deeper into the maze of mirrors and shadows. Suddenly the laughter stopped. The silence that followed was so thick, so absolute that it made the hair on my arms stand on end. I froze, straining to hear something, anything. And then, in the distance, I heard it. A faint rhythmic sound. It was so subtle I almost didn't notice it at first. A soft thudding, like footsteps, but heavier, slower, coming toward me. I tried to move, but my legs felt like lead rooted to the spot. The funhouse grew colder, the air thick with the scent of something metallic like rust or blood. The footsteps grew louder, closer, each one sending a jolt of terror through my veins. Then, out of the corner of my eye, I saw movement. A shadow, just beyond the reach of my failing flashlight. Slowly, I turned toward it, my breath catching in my throat. There, in the far corner of the room, something stepped into the weak beam of light. A figure, tall, thin. Its face painted in a grotesque mask of white. Its eyes hollow, lifeless. A clown. But this wasn't the cheerful, colorful clown of children's parties. No, this was something much darker. Its smile was too wide, its teeth too sharp, its eyes gleaming with something that wasn't quite human. It took another step forward, and the room seemed to warp around it, the walls groaning in protest. I wanted to scream, to run, but I couldn't. My body refused to obey. And then, it laughed. A low, guttural sound that rumbled from deep within its chest, vibrating through the walls, through my bones. It was a sound of pure malice, of hunger. The other clowns began to appear, emerging from the shadows, their painted faces twisted in mirth, their laughter rising into a cacophony that filled the room. They encircled me, closing in, their footsteps silent, their eyes gleaming with dark intent. I tried to back away, but my foot caught on something. I looked down and gasped. There, lying in the dust, was a small shoe, half buried in the grime of the funhouse floor. A child's shoe. Suddenly, I understood. The stories were true. The clowns didn't just disappear. They never left. And neither would I. As their painted faces loomed closer, the last thing I heard was their laughter, echoing through the darkness. And then, everything went black. I awoke to darkness, suffocating and cold. The air was thick, clinging to my skin like a wet shroud. My body ached, my limbs heavy and unresponsive, as if I'd been lying there for days. The distant sound of laughter, soft and mocking, played at the edges of my awareness. I blinked, trying to adjust to the void around me. Then, the mirrors came into focus. I was lying in the center of a hall of mirrors, endless and warped. Every reflection of me stretched out in grotesque, impossible ways, each version of myself distorted, alien, wrong. The clowns stood around me, their painted faces frozen in wide, terrible grins, watching, waiting. My breath quickened, a surge of panic rising in my chest. I tried to move, but I couldn't. The clowns had surrounded me, their ghostly forms shifting in and out of view like apparitions in the fog. They weren't just reflections anymore. They were real. And they were closer. The distorted funhouse mirrors loomed overhead, reflecting not just the clowns, but something darker. In each one, I saw fragments of the souls they had claimed. Children, teenagers, adults. All of them were trapped in the glass, their eyes hollow, their mouths open in silent screams that would never be heard. Their hands pressed against the surface, desperate to escape. But there was no escape. I could feel the weight of the funhouse around me, the walls closing in, alive with the lingering energy of every life it had consumed. It was more than just a building. It was a living entity, a vessel for the endless torment of those who dared to enter. And I had been foolish enough to think I could leave. The clowns began to move, their laughter returning in soft, unsettling waves. Their footsteps echoed unnaturally, each step pulling them closer, their painted faces contorting into something far more sinister. One by one, they stepped into the hall, their forms no longer confined to mere reflections. The funhouse had bent reality itself, allowing them to exist in both worlds, the one of glass and the one of flesh. I scrambled to my feet, the weight of their presence suffocating me. I stumbled backward, bumping into one of the mirrors. The surface rippled under my touch, cold and unyielding like ice. I tried to push through it, to escape, but the glass resisted, sealing me in. Then, something shifted. In the reflection, I saw them. The missing children, the teenagers, all the lost souls who had ventured here before me. They stood just behind the clowns, their eyes wide and empty, staring straight at me. Their mouths twisted into twisted grins, their bodies moving in unison with the clowns as though they were one and the same. I was no longer an outsider. I was becoming part of the show. Desperation clawed at my mind, but the funhouse was not done with me yet. The mirrors flickered, each reflection showing a different version of myself. In one, I was a clown, my face painted in garish reds and whites, my smile too wide, too cruel. In another, I was trapped behind the glass, banging on the surface, my eyes pleading for release. But the worst reflection, the one that chilled me to my core, was the one where I was laughing with them. I could feel it now. A pull, deep inside me. The longer I stayed, the less I resisted. The clowns weren't attacking me. Not yet. They were waiting. Waiting for me to give in, for the madness to take hold. And it was working. The walls of the funhouse bent and twisted, my sense of time unraveling, my thoughts no longer my own. I could hear the whispers now, louder, clearer. Join us. I fell to my knees, clutching my head as their voices pierced my skull, their laughter curling around my thoughts like a noose. My fingers trembled as I pressed them against the cold, unforgiving floor. In the reflection, I saw my own painted face staring back at me, the grin spreading wider and wider. No, I had to get out, I had to escape. But how? Then, through the haze of fear and laughter, I remembered something. The fire, the legends. They said the fire that consumed the clowns all those years ago wasn't an accident. It was a desperate attempt to cleanse the place, a way to break the curse. But the fire hadn't worked. The funhouse had survived. And now, I was trapped in the belly of the beast. Suddenly, the clowns stopped laughing. The air grew thick with anticipation. One of them, the leader, stepped forward. His grin was wider than the others, his eyes dark pits of endless malice. He reached out, his gloved hand inches from my face, and whispered, "It's time." I closed my eyes, waiting for the end. But instead of the cold touch of his hand, I felt warmth. Heat. My eyes flew open, and there it was. A flame. Small and flickering, but growing. The mirrors around me began to shimmer, cracking under the weight of the heat. The glass splintered, spiderwebbing out from the source of the flame. The fire was back. And this time, it wasn't here to consume me. It was here to destroy them. The clowns recoiled, their once mocking grins twisting into something far more primal, fear. The fire spread quickly, licking at the walls of the funhouse, igniting the twisted reflections, the glass shattering with deafening cracks. The souls trapped in the mirrors began to wail, their voices joining the inferno in a crescendo of terror. I staggered to my feet, the flames raging around me, consuming the funhouse in a blaze of vengeance. The clowns were screaming now, their painted faces melting away, revealing the hollow creatures beneath. I ran. I didn't know where I was going, but I didn't care. The funhouse was collapsing, the walls crumbling as the fire devoured everything in its path. Finally, I burst through the doors, the cool night air hitting my face like a wave of relief. Behind me, the funhouse was engulfed in flames, the echoes of laughter still faintly audible, but growing weaker with every second. I didn't look back. I didn't need to. The fire had done its work. The funhouse, the clowns, were gone. Or so I thought. As I reached my car, breathless and shaking, I heard it again. Just for a moment. A single soft giggle carried on the wind, and I knew. The funhouse was gone. But the echoes of the laughing clowns would never truly die. They were waiting. And someday, they would laugh again. In a small, forgotten town where time seemed to stand still, there was an amusement park called Whispering Pines. It was said to have once been a paradise of joy, but now only faded memories and an eerie silence remained. The gates were rusted, and the faded signs felt like distant recollections, but the legend of the carousel that spun at midnight lived on in the minds of the locals. "Have you heard about Whispering Pines?" Max asked, his eyes lighting up with excitement. "They say the carousel there moves on its own at midnight, haunted by the whispers of forgotten souls." "That sounds pretty creepy," Lily replied, shrugging. "Why do people still tell those stories if it's just a legend?" Dean, always eager for adventure, interjected, "I think we should go explore. Let's prove that it's just an empty tale." Amber, Dean's best friend, looked at the group with skepticism. "Are you sure there's nothing scary there? Maybe it's best not to mess with the unknown." "Don't be afraid," Dean said, taking Amber's hand. "We'll only be there for a little while, then we'll head back. Just think of the great stories we'll have to tell." The group agreed, and on a chilly autumn evening, they decided to explore the park. The universe seemed to sink into darkness as they approached the gates, their footsteps echoing in the stillness. A sense of anticipation filled the air, and the shimmering moonlight appeared to guide them. As they passed through the rusted gate, a cold wind swept through, causing dry leaves to scatter on the ground. The old rides stood still like tombstones of memories, but the carousel at the heart of the park drew their gaze like a lighthouse in the dark. "Wow, look at that." Max pointed at the carousel, where the faded horses and vibrant colors seemed to glimmer under the moonlight. "It looks like it's still alive." "It's as if it's waiting for us," Lily whispered, a mix of excitement and fear in her voice. As the group drew closer, they felt an unusual chill envelop them. The sounds of children's laughter began to drift through the air, but from nowhere, like echoes carried away by the wind. Dean swallowed hard, but was determined not to let fear stop him. "Well, let's find out if it's true," Dean said, stepping up to the carousel. The others hesitated, torn between curiosity and trepidation. Amber felt her heart race as she stepped forward with Dean. "Don't do anything reckless, Dean. We don't know what's waiting for us." But Dean merely smiled. "It'll be fine. If anything happens, we can just leave immediately." He placed his hand on one of the horses, feeling the cold paint beneath his fingers. Suddenly, the carousel began to emit sounds, its rusty gears creaking. The lights flickered on, and in an instant, it started to turn slowly. The group stood frozen, unable to believe their eyes. "What's happening?" Lily exclaimed. "We activated it!" Max shouted. Yet he couldn't look away from the spectacle before him. The dim lights reflected off the horses, making them appear strangely alive. "Let's go! Let's go!" Amber cried. But none of them could move. It was as if an invisible force was holding them in place. The laughter grew clearer, echoing around them like a ghostly song. "Save me!" they heard. But from where? The sense of excitement and fear surged as the carousel began to spin faster, drawing them into a whirlwind of light and sound. "We need to find a way out!" Dean yelled, but they all felt themselves being pulled into this strange vortex, unable to resist. And then, everything around them began to blur, and in that moment, they knew that what was happening had surpassed anything they could imagine. As the world around them twisted and turned, Amber felt a strange sensation wash over her. One moment, they were standing in front of the carousel, and the next, they found themselves scattered across vibrant, dreamlike landscapes, each of them enveloped in a different memory. Amber blinked and stood in a sunlit meadow filled with laughter. Children danced around her, their joy infectious. The air was warm, and the scent of wildflowers filled her lungs. She glanced at the horse she had chosen, now alive and galloping freely, its mane flowing in the breeze. "This is amazing," Amber thought, a smile spreading across her face. But just as quickly the scene began to shift. The laughter faded, replaced by eerie silence. Shadows stretched across the ground, and she could sense something lurking just beyond her vision. Suddenly, a chilling scream pierced the air, yanking Amber back to reality. The joyful children were now being dragged into the darkness, their faces twisted in terror. "No, stop!" she cried out, but her voice was lost in the wind. Meanwhile, Dean found himself amidst a crowded carnival, vibrant fireworks exploding overhead. Excitement buzzed in the air, but something felt off. The people around him wore exaggerated smiles, yet their eyes were hollow, devoid of life. He mounted the snarling lion, trying to shake off the unease. "Hey! Is this real?" he shouted to no one in particular, but the faces around him continued to laugh and dance as if he were invisible. Then, one by one, the carnival goers began to vanish, leaving only their empty clothes behind. The lion roared, but the sound was muffled, echoing like a distant memory. Lily, floating serenely on a swan, marveled at the beauty of the shimmering lake under the moonlight. Yet, as she looked closer, a wave of dread washed over her. Pale hands began to rise from the depths, reaching up to pull her under. "No! Help!" she screamed, her voice barely a whisper. Max, riding the black dragon, soared through a stormy sky, exhilaration flooding his senses. The wind whipped past him as he climbed higher, But soon the sky darkened. A blinding light broke through the clouds, and the dragon beneath him began to disintegrate into ash. He plummeted downward, the whispers of lost children swirling around him, desperate and pleading. Back in the carousel's realm, the spinning intensified, pulling the teens deeper into their own personal nightmares. Amber fought to stay grounded, the images of joy twisted by the pain of loss weighing heavily on her heart. What is happening? Why are we here? She wondered, desperation creeping into her thoughts. Suddenly a voice emerged from the chaos, soft yet insistent. You have to set us free. Amber jerked her head around, searching for the source. Who are you? She called, but the voice seemed to echo from everywhere and nowhere at once. It's the spirits, she realized, her mind racing. We're trapped in their memories, and we have to help them. She focused on the children's laughter that had once brought her joy, now overshadowed by terror. She had to break the cycle before it consumed them all. Guys, we need to find out what happened here, Amber shouted, hoping to reach the others through the haze. Slowly the others began to break free from their visions, blinking as if awakening from a dream. Dean shook his head, trying to regain his senses. What just happened? I saw... He trailed off, looking around as fear settled in. Lily's eyes widened as she grasped the situation. Those weren't our memories. They belong to the ghosts. We're living their last moments. Max, still shaking from the chaos, nodded. We need to piece together their stories. Maybe that's how we can escape. As they gathered their strength, the carousel continued to spin around them, whispering secrets of the past, pulling them deeper into the cycle. They knew they had to find a way to finish what was left undone, to release the souls trapped within the carousel's grasp. Let's find something, anything that can help us understand what happened here, Amber urged, leading the way back toward the carousel's center. But the dark creature from the carousel's heart was watching, waiting for their next move. As they ventured deeper into the park, the air grew thicker with tension, the whispers echoing louder with each step. The once familiar laughter now felt like a taunt, urging them to uncover the tragic truth hidden within the park's decaying walls. Amber led the group toward the carousel, its once vibrant colors now dulled and grim. We have to find something that belonged to the spirits, she said, determination in her voice. Anything that can give us a clue about their stories. They searched frantically, pushing through the overgrown weeds and debris that littered the ground. Max noticed an old ticket booth nearby, its glass shattered and covered in grime. Over here. Let's check this out, he called, pointing to the remnants of forgotten fun. Inside, they found dusty ledgers and crumpled tickets, remnants of laughter now turned to sorrow. Look at this, Dean said, flipping through a brittle book. These names, they're all children. Lily leaned closer, scanning the pages. These entries, some of them haven't been checked out. It's like they just disappeared. Disappeared? Amber echoed, a chill creeping up her spine. What if the carousel was used to trap them, like a way to keep their joy alive while they were taken? Suddenly, a faint sound caught their attention. A child's laughter, distant yet familiar. It resonated from the direction of the carousel. The teens exchanged nervous glances but felt compelled to follow the sound. As they approached, the carousel began to spin again, this time slower, almost as if inviting them. The air buzzed with energy, and the painted animals seemed to come alive once more, their eyes filled with longing. Amber, we can't, Dean warned, taking a step back. What if it pulls us in again? We need to finish what we started, she replied, her gaze locked on the dark creature at the center, which seemed to pulse with a malevolent energy. We have to free them, even if it means confronting the darkness. Taking a deep breath, the group stepped closer to the carousel. The laughter grew louder, and suddenly they were pulled into another vision, a birthday party frozen in time. The decorations were colorful, balloons swaying gently, and a table filled with uneaten cake. A little girl stood at the center, waiting eagerly for her friends, but no one came. Her smile faded as shadows encroached upon the scene, and the laughter turned to silence. The girl looked around, confusion etched on her face. "Finish it for us," the whispers echoed again, now clearer, more urgent. Amber felt a surge of empathy. "We need to help her," she urged. "We can't let her wait any longer." Lily stepped forward, her heart aching for the lost child. "I'll light the candles," she said, taking a deep breath. She rushed to the table and found a box of matches, striking one against the rough surface. The flame flickered to life, illuminating the girl's hopeful face. As Lily lit the candles, the whispers transformed into joyous laughter, a melody of happiness intertwined with relief. The girl's expression shifted, and for the first time, she smiled genuinely. Suddenly, the scene around them began to fade, the party dissolving into light as the girl's laughter echoed softly. "Thank you," she called, her voice sweet and clear before vanishing into the ether. But just as they thought they were making progress, the carousel spun faster, drawing them back into the darkness. The twisted creature leered at them, its eyes glinting with hunger. "You've freed one, but many remain," it growled, the sound reverberating through their bones. Panic surged through the group. "What do we do?" Max shouted, grasping Amber's arm tightly. "Keep finding their stories," Amber shouted back, her voice steady despite the fear. "We can't stop now." They moved from memory to memory, piecing together the fragments of lost lives. They found a doll lying in the grass, a forgotten teddy bear under a swing, and the echoes of children's laughter guiding them as they hurried to restore what was taken. With each resolved memory, the atmosphere shifted, the oppressive weight lifting just a little. The carousel slowed, the creature's grip weakening. Finally, they faced the dark horse once more. "This is it," Amber declared, realizing it was the source of the curse. "We need to confront it together." As they stood united, the whispers around them transformed into a deafening roar. "You cannot stop me!" the creature bellowed, its eyes blazing with fury. "Maybe not alone," Dean shouted, "but together we can break the cycle." With their combined strength, they focused their energy, channeling the joy they had restored. The carousel began to spin wildly, faster and faster, until the lights flickered and exploded into a brilliant display. In that moment of chaos, the dark creature roared, its form disintegrating as the spirits soared free, their joyful laughter echoing through the park. As dawn broke over whispering pines, the carousel came to a shuddering halt. Its darkness lifted. The teens stood breathless, tears streaming down their faces, feeling the weight of the lost souls finally released. But just as they turned to leave, Amber caught a glimpse of something, a figure standing in the ashes, eyes glinting with a lingering rage. The park was quiet, but the air crackled with uncertainty. The carousel was gone, but the shadows remained, hinting that the story wasn't finished yet. A thick fog covered the ground, enveloping the paths leading into the abandoned amusement park, left desolate many years ago. Faded billboards hung loosely, their letters blurred and no longer legible. In the distance, a giant Ferris wheel stood alone like a forgotten giant, its cabins creaking in the light breeze. Though long abandoned, it still remained, looming against the sky like an eerie symbol of the place. John, a determined investigative journalist, stood before the park's main gate. His eyes scanned the rusted iron bars and the corroded statues, a chilling sensation creeping into his mind. He had heard too many stories about the mysterious disappearances, the rumors that many people in this small town had either forgotten or deliberately ignored. What was once a bustling, lively park was now only a deadly memory, recalling the horrific events that occurred many years ago. John couldn't resist his curiosity. He had spent months investigating the sudden closure of the park. Documents and accounts all pointed to a single event, a series of strange disappearances, all centered around the giant Ferris wheel. "It's the one," John muttered, his eyes fixed on the still Ferris wheel. He pushed the rusted gate, its creaking sound echoing through the desolate space, resonating along the empty paths of the park. Inside, everything was abandoned, as if everyone had left in a hurry. Food stalls lay neglected. Small bumper cars were scattered, covered in dust, and the wind howled through the old attractions, only heightening the eerie atmosphere. John began his investigation by searching through old documents. He rummaged through forgotten papers in the manager's office, where filing cabinets still lay in disarray. Through the yellowed pages, John gradually uncovered a horrifying truth. The park had closed immediately after a series of mysterious disappearances. All the victims were last reported near or on the giant Ferris wheel. None of them were ever found, and the reason for the park's closure faded into obscurity. Night was falling as John stepped out of the office, clutching papers filled with terrifying information. But just then, a strange sound echoed from afar, startling him. He looked toward the Ferris wheel. In the darkness that was slowly descending, the lights on the Ferris wheel suddenly flickered on. The old bulbs flashed, illuminating the entire area around it, as if it were still operational. The Ferris wheel began to slowly turn, even though no one was controlling it. John's heart raced. His rational mind screamed at him to leave immediately, but an irresistible urge drew him closer. The hanging cabins began to emit a strange whistling sound as they moved, like a mysterious and dangerous invitation. He stopped before the last cabin. His hand trembled as he gripped the cabin door's handle and opened it. A cold gust of air wafted out from inside, causing him to step back, but then, as if guided by an unseen force, he stepped into the cabin and closed the door behind him. The cabin began to shake as the Ferris wheel slowly lifted it higher. Lights twinkled around the Ferris wheel, but inside, darkness swallowed everything. John could clearly feel that something was waiting for him at the top of the ride. The cabin swayed gently as it slowly lifted John higher, leaving the ground and the decaying amusement rides below. The lights of the Ferris wheel shone in an eerie way, casting a pale yellow glow through the thick fog. From inside the cabin, John looked down and realized that the park no longer looked the same as when he had entered. The paths he had just walked now appeared hazy, as if they were being erased from reality. A cold wind blew through the cracks in the cabin, but John's attention was quickly drawn inward. An odd sensation filled the space, causing the temperature to plummet. He pulled out his phone, but there was no signal. The screen displayed only lifeless white lines. As John prepared to stand, a faint, soft laugh echoed from behind him, freezing him in place. Turning around, John was confronted with a horrifying sight. Sitting across from him was a shadowy figure, its face so blurred that it was almost impossible to discern any features. Its hollow eyes were fixed on John. His heart pounded as he realized this was one of the missing victims he'd read about. Not just one, but gradually similar figures began appearing in the other cabins surrounding the Ferris wheel, all motionless, their eyes locked on him. "You won't escape either," a voice whispered, louder this time, as if it came from everywhere around him. Panic-stricken, John tried to open the cabin door to jump out, but it was firmly locked. The cabin continued to sway in the air as the wheel lifted him higher. The lights outside seemed to flicker more violently, casting a sinister glow on the ghostly faces of the spirits watching him. "What the hell is happening?" John muttered, cold sweat soaking his back. Suddenly the cabin stopped at the highest point of the Ferris wheel. Everything seemed to freeze in that moment. There was no sound except for John's heavy breathing. He looked out through the window, but the view below had completely changed. The abandoned amusement park was gone, replaced by a bustling, brightly lit city. But it wasn't any city John recognized. Towering buildings twisted into unnatural shapes, the sky was covered by a thick, inky blackness, and the streets below were crowded with strange, lifeless figures shuffling aimlessly. John realized that what he was witnessing wasn't reality. It was another world, a distorted version of his own. But the horror didn't stop there. As he looked closer, he saw the figures below beginning to change. Their faces cracked open, their bodies twisted and contorted into grotesque shapes. All of them were facing the Ferris wheel, as if waiting for him to join them. A shiver ran down John's spine. He wasn't just seeing another world, he was feeling it. A whisper echoed in his mind, like a dark invitation from this twisted reality. The Ferris wheel, with its mysteries and disappearances, wasn't just an innocent ride. It was a gateway to countless other realities, each one dominated by inexplicable terror. "Just one more turn," the disembodied voice spoke again. "Then you'll understand. The price you must pay." John felt the cabin begin to move again, this time lowering him back down toward the ground. But before he could breathe a sigh of relief, a figure suddenly appeared beside him in the cabin, a young girl with a pale, terrified face. "Save me," she whispered, her voice trembling. "Don't let them take me. Don't let the wheel bring me back there." She was one of the missing victims. John recognized her from the photos in the files, but before he could say anything, the girl vanished, as if she had never been there, leaving the cabin empty once more. At that moment, John understood. The Ferris wheel wasn't just making people disappear. It was a trap, an endless cycle between dark realities, where anyone caught in it would pay the ultimate price, with their soul. As the cabin continued descending, John knew he had only one chance to escape this place, and he had to solve the mystery fast, before he became a permanent passenger on the wheel of death. As John's cabin descended, the flickering lights of the Ferris wheel grew dim, as if they were about to go out entirely. He could feel an invisible force closing in on him, pulling him toward the dark realities the wheel controlled. But John couldn't let himself fall into this trap. He had to find a way to break the nightmare cycle before it was too late. The moment his feet touched the ground, John leaped from the cabin. The door creaked open with a haunting screech, and the Ferris wheel continued to spin slowly as if nothing had happened. But now John knew it was no ordinary ride. It was a twisted machine, controlling distorted realities and trapping the souls of those who dared to step inside. He rushed to the main control building, once the heart of the amusement park. The rotting wooden door easily gave way as John shoved it open. Inside, everything seemed to have ceased functioning long ago. But in the corner of the room, a control panel remained intact, its dusty buttons untouched. John rifled through the scattered documents on the desk. They all led to the same conclusion. The Ferris wheel was not just an amusement ride. It had been built by a mysterious figure who used it as a machine to connect different dimensions. The disappearances weren't random. They were drawn into an endless loop between realities, never to return. Another file revealed an even more terrifying truth. There was only one way to break the Ferris wheel's curse. The one who wrote it had to complete the final round on their own, face their deepest fear, and sacrifice what mattered most, their own memories. John's heart tightened as he read the final lines. "My memories," he whispered, eyes wide with shock. To escape this place, he would have to give up everything that made him who he was. Every memory, every fragment of his life. He would become a nameless figure, forever wandering between dark realities. But before John could think further, the Ferris wheel outside began to move again. Its grinding sound echoed through the empty park, urging him to return. He knew his time was running out. John stepped out of the building, the pale lights of the Ferris wheel glaring at him. Lost souls, shadowy figures, appeared scattered throughout the park, silently watching him. They were the ones who hadn't escaped the cycle, trapped forever. He knew what he had to do, but the thought of giving up his identity made him shudder. How could he let go of everything and become an empty shell without memories? But there was no other choice. John swallowed hard and approached the Ferris wheel once more, the weight of the decision bearing down on each step. The cabin opened before him, welcoming him one final time. John took his seat again, and the door closed. The Ferris wheel began its ascent, each movement stretching on endlessly. Outside, Reality started to warp, scenes overlapping like a fast-forwarded film. John saw familiar faces, his family, friends, his past and present, all drifting away, fading into the distance. As the cabin reached its highest point, a voice echoed in his mind, deep and resonant. "You have chosen," the voice whispered. "You will remember nothing, but you will be free." Before John's eyes, the world spun one last time, and he found himself standing in front of his small home, the place where he had once lived. The door stood open, but inside there was only endless darkness. His memories began to dissolve, like grains of sand swept away in the wind. John closed his eyes, feeling everything slip away. And then, when he opened them again, he was no longer John. He didn't know who he was, couldn't remember anything about his life, the park, or the Ferris wheel. But he was free. The Ferris wheel stood still, its lights fading, returning silence to the park. There was no trace of John or the lost souls. Yet something remained, waiting patiently for the next victim to be drawn into its endless loop. It started as a thrill-seeking adventure. Urban exploration was a hobby for Caleb and his friends, a way to spice up their otherwise mundane lives. They'd heard whispers of an old amusement park just outside of town, a place that had been shut down in the late 90s. No one knew why it had closed so suddenly, but for years rumors swirled about accidents, mysterious disappearances, and something darker. The park, once called Sunny Heights Funland, was anything but sunny now. It was hidden behind a wall of overgrown trees and rusting gates, left to rot and decay. Vines snaked over ticket booths, peeling paint clung to cracked facades, and the wind whistled through the empty remains of carnival games. Everything was eerily quiet. The group, armed with cameras and flashlights, pushed through the entrance. Caleb led the way, excitement bubbling in his chest, while his girlfriend Emily followed close behind. Behind them were Jake and Lisa, equally eager but with a touch of unease as they eyed the empty rides. "Check it out," Jake whispered, pointing toward the roller coaster, the centerpiece of the park. It stood tall, its skeletal frame rising against the backdrop of a gray, overcast sky. The ride was called the Final Ride, though no one could remember why it had earned such an ominous name. The tracks disappeared into a tunnel near the far end of the park, and a long, silent train sat still at the loading platform. Caleb's eyes lit up when he saw it. "Do you think it still works?" he asked, half joking, though his curiosity was piqued. "Don't even think about it," Emily said with a nervous chuckle, brushing her hair out of her face. But Caleb was already moving towards it, pulling the weeds away from the rusted gate that led to the ride's entrance. "Just one look," Caleb insisted. "I mean, it's probably not safe, but it could be cool to see it up close." The group followed reluctantly, their footsteps crunching on gravel. As they reached the platform, an uneasy feeling settled over them. There was something off about the final ride. The air was heavy, and the silence felt suffocating, like the park was holding its breath. Jake broke the tension, laughing as he hopped into one of the empty coaster cars. "Come on, it's not like it's going to move or anything, it's just a bunch of metal." Caleb hesitated for a moment, but then climbed in after him. Emily and Lisa stayed on the platform, exchanging nervous glances. Just as Caleb sat down, a loud click echoed through the air. The restraints slammed down over him and Jake, locking them in place. "What the?" Jake started, his voice rising in panic. Suddenly the ride jolted to life. The grinding of gears echoed through the park as the train began to move slowly up the incline. "Caleb!" Emily screamed, frantically pulling at the restraints, but they wouldn't budge. Lisa stood frozen, her face pale, as the train climbed higher and higher, disappearing into the shadowy mouth of the tunnel. Inside the tunnel, everything went black. Caleb's heart pounded in his chest, his mind racing. How was this even happening? The park had been abandoned for decades. There was no power, no workers. This was impossible. As they reached the peak of the track, The world around them seemed to warp. The temperature dropped, and the air became thick with a sour metallic smell. Caleb tried to scream, but his voice felt trapped in his throat. Then, without warning, the visions began. Dark, twisted images flashed before Caleb's eyes. Children with hollow eyes wandering through the park, blood-stained clowns laughing maniacally, and shadows creeping behind every corner. There were glimpses of the past, flashes of the park's glory days, tainted with horror. Bodies buried beneath the Ferris wheel, people screaming as they were swallowed whole by the rides. The coaster plunged downward into a spiral, and Caleb could feel something pulling at his mind. It was as if the park itself was alive, feeding on their fear, dragging them deeper into its nightmare. He could hear Jake screaming next to him, but his voice was distant, fading into the void. And then, nothing. Emily and Lisa stood on the platform for what felt like hours. The roller coaster never came back. Desperate, Emily called out their names, but there was no response, only the eerie silence of the abandoned park. Her hand shook as she pulled out her phone, but the screen showed no service. It was as if the world outside of the park no longer existed. "They're gone," Lisa whispered, her voice barely audible. "We have to leave. Now." But Emily couldn't move. Her eyes were locked on the tunnel where Caleb and Jake had disappeared. Her mind screamed at her to run, to get out, but her body wouldn't listen. She could feel the park watching her, waiting, hungry. She finally turned to Lisa, but her friend was gone too. Only the faint echo of footsteps remained. They were never found. The local authorities conducted a half-hearted search of the park, but no traces of Caleb, Jake, or Lisa were ever discovered. Sunny Heights Funland was sealed off once more, its gates chained shut and the legend growing darker with every passing year. Some say the park was cursed, built on land that should never have been disturbed. Others believe that it wasn't a curse at all, but something far worse. Something that had been waiting for people like Caleb and his friends to stumble into its trap. The final ride remains untouched, a rusting monument to the lost, its cars still sitting at the top of that first incline, waiting for the next group of explorers foolish enough to try their luck. But no one who rides ever comes back, and no one ever will.